Before we get into this disturbing true story, tell me first, where are you watching from right now? And if you enjoy real mysteries that still have no clear explanation, make sure to subscribe, because stories like this take serious time, research, and fact-checking to uncover. What police discovered inside this house wasn't just strange, it left investigators silent, reports unfinished, and questions that remain unanswered to this day. It began as nothing more than a routine call. The kind officers respond to dozens of times a week, without giving it much thought. Late in the afternoon, just as daylight was beginning to fade, dispatch received a complaint from a neighbor about a strange smell coming from an old house at the end of a quiet residential street. The home had been empty for months, maybe longer. No lights, no movement, no visitors. At first, people assumed it was just another abandoned property rotting from the inside out. But the smell was different, sharp, metallic, mixed with something sour that carried farther than it should have. Enough to make neighbors nervous. Enough to make them call the police. When the first two officers arrived, they expected the usual. Maybe a dead animal in the walls. Maybe squatters. Maybe nothing at all. The house itself looked unremarkable. 2 stories, faded paint, windows clouded with dust. The front door was locked, but not forced. The yard was overgrown, yet oddly undisturbed, as if no one had walked through it in a long time. Still, procedure is procedure. They knocked. No answer. They circled the property, checking windows, finding nothing broken, nothing open. That's when one of the officers noticed something that didn't sit right. The back door was warm to the touch. That alone raised concern. An abandoned house shouldn't hold heat like that, especially not in early evening. They called it in, requested backup, and made entry. The inside smelled worse, thick, heavy, clinging to the air. The furniture was still there, coated in dust but neatly arranged, as if the owners had simply stood up one day and walked out mid-conversation. Family photos lined the walls. Dishes sat in the sink. A calendar still hung in the kitchen, stopped on a date from years earlier. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken glass, no obvious reason the house should feel occupied. The officers began a room-by-room check, announcing themselves as they went. Nothing responded. No movement. No sound except the creak of floorboards under their boots. But the smell intensified as they moved deeper into the house, strongest near the staircase. One officer noted that the temperature changed noticeably halfway up the steps, cooler, then suddenly warmer again, like walking through invisible pockets of air. It made no sense, but they kept going. Upstairs, the bedrooms were just as untouched, beds made, closets full. Dust thick enough to suggest no one had been there in a long time. And yet, the smell was strongest here. That's when they noticed something subtle, but disturbing. The hallway wall near the master bedroom didn't match the rest. The paint tone was slightly off. The surface looked newer, smoother. One officer ran his hand along it and felt a faint vibration, almost like a low hum. So quiet you'd miss it if you weren't paying attention. At first, they thought it might be faulty wiring or pipes, but the house records showed no recent renovations, no permits, no reason for a section of wall to look freshly sealed. When they knocked on it, the sound was hollow. Not the solid thud of a support wall, but something else, something empty behind it. By now, backup had arrived. 4 officers stood in that hallway, all feeling the same unease, all smelling the same unexplained odor. They debated calling in a building inspector or fire department. But protocol allowed them to investigate further if there was reason to believe someone could be inside. And there was reason. The warmth, the smell, the hollow wall. They carefully pried away a small section of drywall. What they expected was a crawl space, maybe old piping, maybe nothing at all. What they found instead made the room go silent. Behind the wall wasn't insulation or wiring, it was a doorway. A narrow, perfectly cut opening, sealed so cleanly that it blended into the wall unless you knew where to look. No handle, no hinges visible. Just a hidden door. No one spoke for several seconds. One officer later said that in that moment, his instincts were screaming that this was no longer a routine call. This wasn't a dead animal. This wasn't squatters. Someone had intentionally built this space to stay hidden. They forced the door open. Cold air rushed out, carrying that same unbearable smell, now stronger than ever. Their flashlights cut into the darkness beyond, revealing a narrow passage descending downward into a part of the house that didn't exist on any blueprint. Dispatch was notified immediately. The tone of the call changed. What started as a simple welfare check had turned into something else entirely. And this was only the beginning. Because whatever lay beyond that hidden doorway was something no one on scene was prepared for, and what police would eventually find inside would leave even seasoned investigators struggling to explain how it got there, who built it, and why it had remained hidden for so long. And that's where this story stops being ordinary and starts becoming something far more disturbing. Once the hidden door was forced open, the officers stood frozen for several seconds, their flashlights trained on the darkness beyond. What lay behind that wall was not a simple storage space or a forgotten crawl area. It was a room, a real, intentionally built room. One that did not appear on any property records, blueprints, or renovation permits connected to the house. The opening was just wide enough for a single person to pass through, and the edges were so carefully sealed that it had been nearly invisible from the outside. Someone had gone to great effort to make sure this space was never found. As the officers stepped inside, the temperature dropped sharply. Their breath became visible even though it was not cold outside. The air felt heavy, stale, and old, yet disturbingly active. The smell intensified. Not just rot, but a mix of damp earth, metal, and something sour that burned the throat. The walls of the hidden room were smooth concrete, not wood or drywall like the rest of the house. This alone made no sense. Pouring concrete inside an existing structure would have required major construction, noise, time, none of which neighbors recalled. The room was small, no larger than a walk-in closet, but tall enough for someone to stand upright. There were no windows, no vents, and no obvious source of electricity, yet the space felt recently used. The floor was clean in some spots, scuffed in others, with clear footprints pressed into fine dust, footprints that varied in size. Some were adult-sized. Others were smaller, unsettlingly smaller. The dust had not settled evenly, suggesting movement within days, not months or years. One officer noticed faint scratch marks along the concrete walls. Not random damage, deliberate lines, repeated in the same places, as if someone had traced the same motions again and again. Near one corner, the concrete was worn smoother than the rest, as if a body had leaned there repeatedly. When a flashlight swept across the floor, something reflective caught the beam. A thin metal hook was embedded into the wall at shoulder height. There was no clear reason for it to be there. No rope attached, no explanation. Then came the sound. It was faint, so faint at first that one officer thought it was radio interference. A low, rhythmic noise, almost like breathing. Everyone stopped moving. The sound continued for several seconds before fading away. When dispatch was contacted, radio logs later confirmed there was no transmission during that time. The room itself had made the sound. As officers continued to search the space, they found objects placed deliberately rather than discarded. A wooden chair pushed against one wall. A folded blanket on the floor, thin and worn, but not dusty like the rest of the room. It had been touched recently. In the corner, there were markings scratched into the concrete, symbols that didn't resemble words or numbers, repeated again and again in tight clusters. Some officers later admitted they avoided looking at them too long, describing a strange pressure behind the eyes when they did. Perhaps the most disturbing detail was what the room lacked. There was no food, no trash, no obvious sign of long-term living, yet everything about the space suggested it had been occupied. Not lived in, but used, as if the room served a purpose that didn't require comfort, light, or explanation. A place meant only to exist unseen. When crime scene investigators arrived, they confirmed something that sent a chill through everyone present. The concrete in parts of the room was newer than the rest of the house by decades. That meant the hidden room had been built long after the home was originally constructed. Someone had altered the structure quietly, precisely, and successfully, without ever raising suspicion. Even more unsettling, thermal scans showed faint residual heat patterns on the floor and walls, inconsistent with an abandoned house. The shape suggested people had been inside recently, standing still for long periods of time, waiting. By the time officers exited the room, the house felt different, quieter, heavier. One officer later said, it felt like the space behind the wall didn't want to be exposed, as if opening it had broken some kind of unspoken rule. The hidden door was resealed temporarily for investigation, but even after it was closed, the smell lingered throughout the house. What troubled police most wasn't just that a hidden room existed. It was how perfectly it had been concealed, how recently it had been used, and how no one could explain who built it or why. Because this wasn't a mistake or a forgotten space from an older time. This room had been hidden on purpose. And whatever its purpose was, it had nothing to do with storage and everything to do with secrecy. As investigators focused their attention deeper inside the hidden room, it became clear that what disturbed them most wasn't the space itself. It was what had been left behind. The objects inside didn't look abandoned or randomly stored. They looked placed, intentional, as if someone had arranged them carefully, knowing one day they might be found. The first thing catalogued was the chair. It was old, wooden, and badly worn, but unlike the rest of the house, it wasn't dusty. The legs showed fresh scuff marks on the concrete floor, suggesting it had been moved recently. The seat was slightly indented, as if someone had been sitting there for long periods of time, facing the wall. Not toward the door, not toward anything comforting, just the blank concrete surface, scratched and marked from repeated contact. Next came the blanket, thin, gray, folded with surprising neatness. It smelled faintly of sweat and something chemical that no one could identify on sight. Forensics later confirmed it did not match any fabric found elsewhere in the house. No matching bedding, no laundry traces. It didn't belong to the residents listed on record, nor to any known manufacturer still operating. It was as if the blanket itself came from somewhere else, or someone else. Along one wall, officers found small personal items laid out in a line. A broken wristwatch stopped at 3017, a child's shoe worn dirty, and decades out of fashion, but not decayed. A rusted key with no matching lock found anywhere in the house. None of these items could be traced to missing persons, previous owners, or known tenants. They didn't belong to the house. They didn't belong to the neighborhood. They didn't belong to any story police could find. Then there were the marks. Scratched into the concrete walls were symbols, shallow at first, then deeper, overlapping each other as if carved repeatedly over time. Some looked like crude shapes. Others resembled tally marks, but not evenly spaced. Some sets ended abruptly, others were crossed out violently. There was no recognizable language, no known religious or cultural pattern. Yet they appeared deliberate, consistent, obsessed. One officer noted that several marks were at child height. Near the far corner of the room, investigators found something that caused the room to go silent again, a recording device. Old, outdated, powered off. No visible power source nearby. But when technicians later examined it, they found audio files still stored on the tape. Most were static, breathing, long periods of silence. But in one recording, lasting only 12 seconds, a faint sound could be heard, a low whimper, followed by a single word whispered too quietly to clearly identify. When enhanced, the word sounded like ear or hear. No one could be sure. What confused police most was how recent everything felt. Despite the house being listed as vacant, several objects showed signs of handling within days. Fingerprints were present, smudged, partial, overlapping. Too degraded to match anyone in the system, but too fresh to be old. Shoe prints in the dust didn't match any footwear worn by officers or neighbors. Whoever had been using the room had left just enough behind to prove they existed, but not enough to be identified. Even stranger, nothing in the room suggested theft, violence, or imprisonment. No restraints, no locks on the inside, no blood, no signs of struggle, which raised a far more disturbing question. If people were in this room, they were there willingly. Or worse, they didn't try to leave. As the evidence was bagged and removed, one officer noticed something unsettling. After items were taken out, new scuff marks appeared near the wall, marks that hadn't been there minutes earlier. Another officer insisted the chair had shifted slightly from its original position. No one could explain it. No air movement, no vibrations, no logical cause. By the time the room was cleared, investigators realized something chilling. None of the objects told a complete story. Each one felt like a fragment, a leftover piece from multiple lives that never connected. As if the room wasn't meant for one person, but many. And as if it wasn't meant to be remembered. The final report would later describe the contents of the hidden room as non-attributable personal effects of unknown origin. But among the officers who stood inside that space, another phrase was used quietly, never written down. They weren't stored here, one officer said. They were left behind. And whatever left them there, never left its name. What unsettled investigators, even more than the hidden room itself, was the undeniable evidence that it had been used very recently. This was not an old space, sealed away decades ago and forgotten. Everything about it suggested activity, recent, deliberate, and ongoing right up until the moment police arrived. That realization changed the entire tone of the investigation. The dust on the concrete floor told the first story. It wasn't evenly settled like dust in an abandoned building. There were clear disturbances, overlapping footprints, some partial, some full, moving back and forth rather than straight in and out. The pattern suggested pacing, waiting, standing still for long stretches, and then moving again. What made it worse was that some prints appeared to be layered over others, meaning different people had been inside at different times. Yet no one had been seen entering or leaving the house for weeks. Temperature readings added another disturbing detail. Thermal scans showed faint residual heat, signatures along the floor and lower wall, inconsistent with ambient conditions. The shapes were irregular, almost human in outline, areas where bodies had been close to the surface for extended periods. One officer quietly noted that it looked like people had been sitting or standing in the same spots repeatedly, as if those places were familiar to them, comfortable in a way that made no sense. The blanket was another red flag. When crime scene technicians lifted it, the concrete beneath was slightly warmer and completely free of dust. That meant it had been moved recently, possibly within hours. Fibers collected from it were not brittle or degraded. They still carried moisture. Someone had touched it. Someone had used it. And they had done so shortly before police arrived. There were also signs of sound. Neighbors later reported that in the nights leading up to the discovery, they had heard faint noises coming from the house, not loud enough to call police at the time, but strange enough to remember later. Soft thumps, a dragging sound. Once, what one neighbor described as a muffled cry that stopped suddenly. At the time, they assumed it was animals. After the discovery of the room, those assumptions felt terrifyingly wrong. Electrical anomalies raised further questions. Even though the hidden room had no visible wiring, power readings fluctuated when officers stood inside it. Radios crackled, flashlights dimmed briefly and then returned to normal. One officer's body camera cut out for several seconds while recording in the room, though it functioned perfectly everywhere else in the house. Technicians later confirmed there was no mechanical failure to explain it. Perhaps the most chilling detail came from the door itself. The edges of the hidden panel showed wear marks that were new, scratches in the paint, tiny flecks of plaster still loose. This door hadn't been sealed and forgotten. It had been opened and closed repeatedly, carefully, quietly. Someone knew exactly how to access it without leaving obvious signs. And yet, no surveillance footage showed anyone entering the property. No neighbors saw lights. No one reported visitors. The house appeared empty until police stepped inside. That meant whoever was using the room knew how to remain unseen, or didn't need to be seen at all. As investigators pieced these details together, one conclusion became impossible to ignore. Whatever this space was for, it hadn't ended. The activity hadn't stopped because time passed. It had stopped because police arrived. That realization hung over the house like a weight. Officers later admitted that when they finally left the scene that night, more than one of them checked over their shoulder, not because they thought someone was following them, but because it felt like something had been interrupted. Like the house had been caught in the middle of something it wasn't finished doing yet. And the most disturbing question of all remained unanswered. If the room had been in use so recently, where did whoever used it go? As investigators continued documenting the hidden room, their attention kept returning to the markings and recordings left behind, not because they were obviously violent or graphic, but because they made no sense in any known context. These were not random scratches, idle doodles, or signs of neglect. They looked intentional, repeated, and deeply personal, as if someone had been communicating with the space itself. The symbols on the walls were the first thing that truly unsettled the forensic team. They weren't graffiti, and they weren't decorative. Each mark had been carved slowly into the concrete, some shallow, others deep enough to chip the surface. Many were repeated in clusters, almost obsessive in nature. A few resembled crude shapes, circles split down the middle, uneven triangles, vertical lines crossed through at odd angles. Others looked like distorted tally marks, but the counting never followed a logical sequence. 3 lines, then 7, then 1. Then a violent slash through all of them. No language expert, historian, or religious consultant could match them to any known system. What made the markings even more disturbing was their placement. Some were carved high on the wall, at adult shoulder level. Others were much lower, roughly at the height of a seated person, or a child standing close to the wall. A few were carved so low they would have required someone to kneel or sit on the floor to make them. This suggested not one individual, but multiple people, possibly of different ages, using the room at different times. Yet no names, initials, or dates appeared anywhere. Whoever made the symbols didn't want to be identified. Near one corner, investigators noticed the markings grew denser, layered over each other, as if the same spot had been revisited repeatedly. The concrete there was worn smoother, darker from constant contact. It looked like a place someone returned to again and again, not to hide, but to focus, to remember, or to wait. Then there were the sounds. The recording device found inside the room raised more questions than answers. It was old, outdated, and incompatible with any modern power source. Yet it contained recordings that were surprisingly clear. Most of the tapes were long stretches of silence broken only by faint ambient noise, breathing, fabric shifting, the subtle scrape of something moving on concrete. These weren't accidental recordings. Someone had intentionally pressed record and then waited. One audio clip stood out. It lasted just over 30 seconds. At first, it sounded like static. Then a low, rhythmic noise emerged, not mechanical, not electrical, breathing, slow, controlled. Then came a faint sound in the background that made several investigators step away from the speakers. When it was played back, a soft tapping, repeated at irregular intervals. Not Morse code, not a pattern anyone could recognize. Just enough repetition to suggest intention. Near the end of the recording, a voice appeared, quiet, strained, almost careful not to be heard. It didn't speak in a full sentence. Just 2 words, whispered so faintly they barely registered. Audio analysts disagreed on what was said. Some heard, "Still here." Others heard, "Stay here." No enhancement produced a definitive answer. What frightened investigators wasn't just what was on the recording, it was what wasn't. There were no screams, no cries for help, no obvious distress. Whoever recorded these sounds wasn't panicking. They were calm, patient, as if this was routine. Further examination revealed small marks on the floor that aligned with where the recording device had been placed before. It had been repositioned multiple times, each time carefully set in nearly the same spot. That meant the person using it returned. More than once, possibly over a long period of time. Then came the symbols found scratched into the floor near that spot. Unlike the wall markings, these were faint, almost hesitant. As if whoever made them didn't want them to be obvious. One investigator noted they looked less like writing and more like attempts to trace something already known, muscle memory rather than creativity. As if the hands remembered what to carve, even if the mind didn't fully understand it anymore. No religious group claimed them. No cult matched them. No known criminal pattern aligned with them. And yet, the consistency suggested purpose, not chaos, not madness, something structured, but hidden. When these findings were shared with senior officials, parts of the report were quietly reclassified. The symbols were labeled non-linguistic repetitive markings. The recordings were described as or ambient audio of unknown origin, neutral language, safe language. Language that avoided admitting the obvious, that no one could explain why these things were there, or who left them behind. Even after the room was cleared, something strange remained. Officers reported that when standing in that space, sounds behaved differently. Voices didn't echo the way they should. Footsteps sounded closer than they were. One investigator said it felt like the room absorbed noise instead of reflecting it, as if it didn't want to give anything back. To this day, the symbols remain unexplained. The recordings remain archived, rarely played, and no one has ever come forward to claim responsibility for them. Because whatever left those marks wasn't trying to send a message to the world. It was documenting something for itself. And the most unsettling thought of all is this: the symbols didn't look finished. What shocked the public most wasn't just what police found inside the house. It was how quickly everything went silent afterward. Despite the evidence, the unanswered questions, and the clear signs that something criminal, or at least deeply abnormal, had taken place, the case was quietly closed. No press conference, no public report, no suspects named. Just a brief statement that the investigation had reached. No actionable conclusion. For a discovery this disturbing, that explanation felt almost insulting. Internally, officers knew the closure didn't make sense. Several investigators later admitted, off the record, that the case never reached a natural end. It was stopped. Files were sealed before standard procedures were completed. Requests for additional forensic testing were denied without explanation. One detective described it as hitting a wall that wasn't supposed to be there. Part of the problem was that none of the evidence fit neatly into a crime category. There were no missing persons officially tied to the address. No blood, no bodies, no forced confinement that could be proven in court. Everything pointed to wrongdoing, but nothing crossed the legal threshold required to proceed. Prosecutors reportedly reviewed the materials and concluded that presenting the case would invite more questions than answers, something they wanted to avoid. Then there was the issue of jurisdiction. Some evidence suggested activity going back years, possibly decades, but property records showed multiple owners, gaps in documentation, and renovations that were never properly permitted. Responsibility blurred across time. No single individual could be clearly tied to the room. And without someone to charge, the case stalled. But that wasn't the whole story. Several officers noticed pressure coming from above. Not threats, something subtler. a sense that continuing to push would be unwelcome. Meetings were postponed. Calls weren't returned. One investigator's report was sent back repeatedly for rewording, not because it was inaccurate, but because the language was deemed too speculative. Another was advised to remove personal observations, even though those observations were standard in similar cases. The recordings caused particular discomfort. Legal advisors warned that releasing audio with no identifiable source could spark panic or conspiracy theories. There was concern about public reaction, not just fear, but mistrust. If authorities admitted they didn't understand what had happened inside that room, it would raise an uncomfortable question. What else might be happening unnoticed? So the narrative was simplified. The house became vacant. The room became non-criminal in nature. The anomalies became inconclusive. Language was carefully chosen to drain the story of its power. Once the case was officially closed, access to the house was restricted. The property was quietly condemned, then sold through a third party. The new owners were never informed of the full history. Within months, renovations began. Walls were torn down. Concrete was poured. The hidden room was erased, physically at least. But even then, not everything disappeared. Requests for the case file under public records laws were repeatedly denied or delayed. When documents were released, key pages were missing. Photographs were redacted. Audio transcripts were summarized instead of shared in full. It became clear that someone, somewhere, didn't want the complete story accessible. Former investigators still talk about the case in hushed tones. Some say it felt like the system chose the easiest path, not justice, not truth, but closure. A way to move on without admitting uncertainty. Others believe the decision was driven by fear, not of a suspect, but of what the case represented, a situation where authority had no answers. And that may be the most unsettling part of all. Cases are usually closed because something is resolved, a confession, an arrest, a mistake corrected. This one was closed because it wasn't resolvable, because acknowledging the unknown was more dangerous than ignoring it. Officially, the house no longer matters. The room never existed. The evidence proved nothing. Unofficially, the case lingers like a stain no report can clean. Because every investigator involved knows the truth, the questions weren't answered. They were buried. And sometimes, what law enforcement chooses not to explain is far more frightening than anything they ever admit.